tight, and then we'll get started in 1 or 2 minutes. All right, good morning. I know folks are still trickling in, but in view of the time and our speaker today, let's get going. Thank you everyone for logging on this morning. My name is Eric Chu. I'm one of the co-directors of the Climate Adaptation Research Center here at UC Davis. We have the real privilege of welcoming Dr. Alessandro Ossola this morning, talking about nature-based solutions. But before we do that, I wanted to share a couple of quick points about how we're going to run the session this morning. As you know already, when you logged on, the session is being recorded, and these recordings will be made available on our center website afterwards. And those of you who have been following the series will have seen that a lot of these recordings and some PowerPoint slides are posted on our website. Of course, a lot of this is pending approval and permission from the authors and presenters themselves, but we try to make most of these available publicly. And our recordings are quite popular, because I know that a lot of folks may not be able to join us during this time. And so our recordings do get quite a few hits. And so that's great to know. Sophia, if you don't mind moving forward with the slides. Yeah, so here are some just quick notes. Everyone is logged on. The meeting, the webinar is being recorded, and everyone is muted, should be muted at this point. There is an opportunity for you to unmute yourself to pose questions, but I ask that you do that at the end, hopefully, so that we give the presenter the opportunity to present everything in one fell swoop, and then we'll come back at the end and have 10-15 minutes of question and answers. If you have clarifying questions during the presentation, please type those into the chat box. Sophia Depew, who's our research assistant, is on hand and will monitor the chat box for any quick problems if anyone encounters anything, and we'll keep tabs on the questions and clarifying questions that you pose in the chat box, and I will bring those back up at the end after a presenter has completed everything. During the presentation, please refrain from unmuting yourself. Turning on your camera is welcome and appreciated, but certainly you don't have to. Is there a next slide, Sophia? Yeah. So, all right. So great. So today we have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Alessandro Ossola, who leads the Urban Science Lab here at UC Davis, and is also a faculty member in the Department of Plant Sciences here at UC Davis. Dr. Ossola is a former U.S. National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine NRC Associate within the National Risk Management Research Lab at the US EPA. And his work deals with several topics, including ecology, climate change science, forestry, water management, food production, planning, and design. I'll let Dr. Ossola introduce himself and his work a little bit more in his presentation, but now I think is the time that I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ossola. And you're going to share your slides from your end. Yeah, great.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm going to see whether everybody can see this. Ring of fire.
Yes.
Beautiful. Thank you for having me today. Thank you for your time. I'm Alessandro Ossola, so I'm a new assistant professor at UC Davis, as explained before. My lab does a lot of inter and transdisciplinary research on the relationship between urban trees and plants in general, people, governance and planning frameworks, as well as climate change. Climate change is the framework in which we are doing most of our research currently, until at least we get support for funding and so on. I spent a significant amount of time in Australia in the last 10 years, and most of the examples that I'm bringing up today are related to Australian work, simply because in Australia, we somehow live at the forefront of climate change impacts, unfortunately. So we have a rapidly urbanizing landscape where most of the Australians live in cities and towns, 95%. And we are increasing our impacts in terms of climate impacts. This talk is really not a lecture. I want to make it as controversial as possible, in the sense that I want to engage with a conversation with you and trying to bounce back and forth idea at the end of our talk. To really challenge the notion that nature-based solutions are a viable solution in a hotter and drier climate. So nature-based solutions, for those of you who are not familiar with, is actually a relatively old concept that is stemming from the European Union legislation maybe a decade ago, and already recently has been uptaked in US policymaking and decision-making, and it trickled down into the California legislation a bit. So something not really innovative and new. What's new is how we frame this in a world that is touching 50 degrees Celsius. And this is where I want to be controversial. First of all, I want to acknowledge the land where I am, and some of you might be. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Patwin people. And today there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: the Kaikil, the Yi Band of the Winton Indian Nation, the Quetzal Di Winton Nation, and the Ocha Di Winton Nation. Apologies for my pronunciation. These people have gathered on this land and steward this land for centuries. And so I want to acknowledge them. The land acknowledgement also brings me to a picture of Australia where our Aboriginal communities really ruled for centuries before the European invaded a couple of 100 years ago. And I want to start from this typical image that most of you might be really familiar with of the impacts that climate change can bring to our landscapes, whether they are urban landscapes or rural landscapes, it doesn't really matter. This is an example of the extent of the bushfires across the Australian eastern seaboard during our austral summer between 2019 and 2020. This is January 4th, satellite imagery. You can see Melbourne and Sydney, but I just want to place a bit of context for you from the United States. The smoke plume across our land here was the size of Georgia and South Carolina. So climate change impacts in Australia are really, really rampant. That particular January 4th, after we already kept our masks on for the smoke before the COVID tragedy, we were already using masks for 6 months earlier than that. That particular day, Sydney, Western Sydney in particular, a city of 5 million people, recorded the hottest temperature on the planet that particular day, that peaked at 48.9 Celsius, which is 120 Fahrenheit. So Sydney was the hottest place on the planet that particular day. We actually had a research grade weather station of a colleague in Western Sydney recorded 51 degrees Celsius for just sort of for a few seconds, but so that was the peak. Our Bureau of Meteorology, which is similar of the National Weather Service here in the United States, actually had to come up with a new color palette for these high temperature maps that includes now a light purple color that wasn't there before because it was too hot. Even, my friends, meteorologists, they couldn't think about, incorporating this type of temperatures in the normal maps. So now we have a new color palette. The issue here, yes, was the extreme temperature for that particular day was pretty crazy. I never experienced on my skin such a crazy temperature. But the routine, the heat routine that we experienced that summer was the crazy bit. We had 46 days out of 66, so 2/3 of the summer over 30 degrees Celsius. Okay, so this is the temperature at which the human body starts to, be stressed significantly. And climate change impacts for public health are, exponentially increasing above 30 degrees Celsius. So we really need to understand how this new heat routine is affecting us, but also is affecting nature and the concept of nature-based solutions that we're gonna talk a bit about in this discussion. I don't know whether you've been to Australia. Usually we have nice green spaces and whatsoever. In Melbourne, that particular summer, we actually had wheelbarrows of dead bats running through our green space. Our native nature, these are flying foxes that are native species of fruit-eating bats. Our native nature is finally giving up. Even despite millennial of evolution in a scorched and barren land, even for our nature, this was simply not just good enough. They couldn't cope. So this is where I want to stimulate your brain cells to acknowledge that some nature simply is not going to make it. These are just few examples of pictures of, cockatoos and birds just dropping dead. And again, bats, even irrigated urban graining was completely, unable to cope. And of course, we had, our hot dogs. They can cope though, if we help them coping. Despite the jokes, this is no joke. And coming back home here, the situation is not that particularly better. If not, we are having very close similarities between the Australian case and the Californian case in this particular situation, but I would argue in many other places along the entire West Coast in the United States and elsewhere. You've been through yourself our wildfire crisis a couple of years ago. Maybe you've been through the extreme heat wave that we had in downtown Sacramento in September last year. These are extreme events, but they are becoming the norm. Extreme means that the intensity, the frequency, and the recurrence of these events is becoming higher, is increasing. So we need to understand how to cope with this, and we need to understand to what extent nature and the solutions that we can envision using nature can be, suitable in this type of future, which is not, very far away from us. So the question for you is to think about is whether nature as a solution to climate change in the first place. I would argue maybe. And now I'm trying to explain why based on some of the research that we have been doing globally. You might see this, might have seen this graph many different times. As the climate warms up, in this case, we have a change in the distribution of the streams and averages in general. So we have a high frequency of extreme heat. We have a high recurrence of extreme weather events, whether they are hot spell days, hot days, heat waves, and so on. And we are cursed by this climate curve. I truly believe this is a curse. We are, unfortunately, this is statistics. Maybe some of you are statisticians in the audience. but we can't do anything about this. So we need to understand how the limits of our nature and human nature and public health can actually cope with this situation. Nature-based solutions are not an innovative thing we do. The use of urban greening to beautify our cities, provide food, and so on, has been around for centuries, if not millennia, since we started greening our cities, let's say in medieval towns in Europe, on the left-hand side here, or even in Mesoamerican settlements. This is an example on the bottom right of Aztec people in ancient Mexico, cropping the urban trees into a walled city. Of course, it wasn't the cities that we can imagine now, but we kept our plants very close to us as humans for literally hundreds, if not millennia of years. So what changed and what's changing fast is the biophysical landscape that we are creating, the urban form, how we plan and build cities, how they look like, how dense they are, and so on, what type of infrastructure is inside the city. But most importantly, we are changing the climate system to the point that all the relationship that we established between us and nature around us is actually changing fast and is impacting both humans and our nature around us. Fast forward, only a couple of hundred years ago, this is an example of, again, settlers from Europe settling the eastern seaboard in Australia, in New South Wales, where Sydney is the capital. You have this gentleman here with his nice hat from Britain, planting this nice elm tree and suggesting that all the elms are growing very well here. They're very well suited for this district. But even 100 years ago, our ancestors, they kind of figured out that the droughty years have been punishing this particular species severely. So in a way, even though we didn't know climate change existed at that time, we knew that some nature wasn't really fully adapted to climate conditions that were too far away from the niche, the native niche where that particular tree was born. Come closer to us these days. Well, if you look at Melbourne legacy of these, first settlers, this is examples from just, news reports in the last 10 years. Tree mortality across the city tripled as, the city itself is impacted by increasing La Nina events, so increasing drought, increasing severity of these extreme periods of lack of water and so on. So the legacy, the historical legacy of this colonial past is somehow, disappearing. These trees that were well suited in Britain, they're definitely not suited in modern day Melbourne, a city of 4.5 million people. Green assets that are really expensive to plant, they're really expensive to manage, is a really expensive nature to keep around us, is just disappearing. And with that, all the benefits that these trees are providing in terms of biodiversity, connection between humans and nature, shading, building, cooling, and so on, they're all gone. Remember, the trees in particular are long-term assets. We are planting them now. They take 50, 100 years to go, to grow to maturity, to provide the benefits that we want them to provide. So you really need to understand that the time frame during which we can use this type of nature-based solutions for adapting to climate change, for instance, is completely different. We need to acknowledge that these organisms, we can't then, grow them and push them to grow in 10 years when naturally they do in 50. So we can't accelerate nature. That's why we need to decelerate climate change in the first place. This is the climogram of that particular summer in Western Sydney. You can see, different dots at different days of maximum air temperature. In yellow and red are days, above 30 degrees Celsius. You can see that it was a very hot summer. In yellow and the orange bars are representing essentially two heat wave events that are embedded in each other. So we are, experiencing these type of events increasingly. At the bottom, you can see that precipitation, these gray bars, was really, really low. So we didn't have water at the same time. So climate extremes are often compounded. The effects are multiplying because we have many, many different stresses. So organisms and us people, we need to adapt to these conditions where it's not a single stress, it's many, many different stresses at the same time. When I mean dealing with colonial legacies, I mean to recognize that what we did in the past, despite, having had some sort of success at some point, is not indicative of the performance that these solutions might have in the future. Past performance is not indicative of future performance, particularly when we talk about organisms that are living. During this particular summer, we had a couple of postdocs that we sent on a safe fieldwork in their car that was air-conditioned, and this Samir and Anthony, they drove across the entire city, every single road, and they measured the mortality and the damage that this extreme summer brought upon our trees. They did it safely from the window of the car inside the air-conditioned car. But we managed to measure how many trees that were defoliated, heavily damaged, lightly damaged, or undamaged. We did this by species. You can see here the ranking of species by damage. And as you can see here, I don't mind you reading all the species. I just want to point out the species with an asterisk at the beginning are all exotic species to Australia. Species that were imported by early settlers, maybe 150 years earlier. They are all dying. Non-native exotic nature in Australia is failing. It's failing because it's not suited for that environment and that climate in the first place, and it's failing because evolutionary that nature never been in an environment like that. Simply this reason they don't have the genes to be able to adapt to these conditions. In this particular study, we also tried to do an economic forecasting of how much money we'll need to spend to completely get rid of these species that are failing and plant these spaces with species that might be able to survive. Just to give you an idea, that amount of money is in the order of dozens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of cash to be able to retrofit suitable nature, climate-ready nature in an urban landscape like Sydney's. So I would suspect that the same issues might be applicable to many of our cities and towns in California and elsewhere, like Arizona. That's why we need to have a proactive approach to this. We can't afford to waste time, energy, money, resources, talent to plant the wrong thing in the wrong spot. We need to stop doing that. So this is the limit. This is an emotional limit. This is a physical limit that we can actually think about, above which 50 degrees Celsius, 122 Fahrenheit, both people are dying and plants are dying, organisms dying. It's really tough. I don't know whether you've been in 50 degrees Celsius, your skin is evaporating. So what we did historically in urban planning, urban forestry strategies, other planning documents, policy making, decision making across the board in the last, I would say, 50, 60, 70 years is that we did all these actions and plannings and plans and regulations and rules and so on, mostly by embracing the averages, the norms, average values, the mean annual temperature, and so on. So this is not good enough. We need to forget the norms and we need to embrace the limits. Bridge engineers in the 40s learn how to build forest streams, okay? Like them, we need to forget our norms and the averages and the medians and embrace the very limits of our nature infrastructure. So, this is an example, just a stupid example from the Tacoma Narrows Bridge that collapsed because of a slight breeze that was somehow multiplying its effects in terms of the frequency, the resonance of the bridge to the point that we collapsed. The bridge collapsed. The same thing is valid for nature. Like those engineers, we need to recognize that climate change is way more than a breeze swinging the bridge. Nature itself can burn. Nature itself will fail. We know this. I know that as an ecologist, as a forester, as an urban planner. We know that. We just need to translate our findings, our science into policies that make sense. So how to do that is a challenge. I don't have all the, the answers to your questions. I'm just here to pose your question, make you think. One way I think about this is through a framework and ideas that are related to climate safety management. Imagine species 1 and 2 or an ecological process. Imagine that we have a maximum temperature. So these species under baseline climate, they have climate safety management here in green. Under a hotter climate, temperature maxima are going up because we have a higher probability of a particular occurrence of that particular temperature. And we have reduced climate safety management to the point that species 1 and ecological process 1 might be still, fine. They might be able to hang on there, but species 2 failed. We need to remove species 2 from the discussion now. Species 2 is not suited for that particular location, for that particular climate in the future. Stop planting species 2. Let's get rid of it. So this is a way to frame how we can think about climate. Climate safety margins and gaps is something that we can measure scientifically, and we can put these hardcore measures in policies and regulations and so on. So we just need to do it. We know how to do it. The other thing I want to bring your attention on is related to the fact that not all green is equally green. And I'm going to take you on a journey on this small aircraft, again, over Adelaide. This aircraft is fitted with a lot of different sensors and thermal cameras and hyperspectral cameras and a lot of things. What we did here in 2017 was actually to keep this aircraft on standby for actually a long time until over Adelaide, we developed a heat dome and we developed heat wave conditions. So when finally the heat wave broke, we actually took to the skies and we flew these aircraft twice, once during the day and once during the night. Along this flight path here, you can see the dotted line. And we were able to measure, a very high resolution image of the bottom here of land surface temperature, in this case during the day. So we measure the thermal landscape during after the third day of a heat wave, so very, very hot conditions. And also we could, pinpoint every single bit of vegetation, whether they were trees, shrubs, and so on, herbs. So what we did here is we demonstrated that if you look at the graph on top, the land surface temperature during the day, of course, is much lower in green if you have, tree canopy patches or grass patches. compared to non-vegetated patches, which is the black line there. But if you are inland, the temperature drop, or land surface temperature drop, it's 10 degrees Celsius almost. So it means that if you have a tree, let's say that we have a budget to plant one tree, you shouldn't plant that tree along the coast. You should plant that tree inland. The same tree, the same nature is providing different benefits in different places. We need to acknowledge that. Otherwise, we are just wasting resources to plant the wrong thing in the wrong spot. Whereas we have a limited amount of money. Now we have Inflation Reduction Act and all these other massive bills at the federal level, California level. We're going to have so much money to spend for climate change adaptation, but we need it to do in the right spot at the right time with the right nature. Otherwise, we're just wasting energy and resources. So what I would like to see in the future is a situation where we don't stop like planning for acute weather extremes. We stop trying to create frameworks to cope with climate change. It's okay to try to improve our responses, for instance, to periodic climate stresses like La Nina, El Nino, climate shocks. We have been trying to transform our cities for the last 10 years, I would say. There is a huge literature on urban transformation that mostly is addressed to trying to patch chronic stresses related to short-term climate change. What we need here is a step change approach where we are planning for the long-term climate change. We are acknowledging that climate stresses are not silent. They are multiple of them. They are interacting with each other, and we need to push climate innovation to the fullest. We can't have a single approach. We need all the different approaches, and we need to stop thinking like we did in the last 50 years, because many of the policies, many of the regulations we are still dealing with, they were designed and thought in a period during which we didn't know even climate change was a real thing. So we need to stop doing that. Of course, this is, harder to do compared to, predicating on this platform here. One way to do it is to holistically take all the different solutions, of which nature-based solutions are just one, and put them, integrate them, and acknowledge that some of these solutions might be suited for, a context like LA, Southern California, and the same solutions might be not suited for Sacramento and Northern California. We need to adjust our solutions to a local context. Urban areas, cities, towns are unique phenomena. There are non-urban areas that are looking alike. There are different histories, there are different cultures, there are different people doing different things. If we don't adapt our policies to these contexts, we're going to fail. This is another example of failure. Very typical of situations like here in California, where PG&E is going to shut down stuff because we have power grid failures, temperature is soaring. At the same time, this is an example on the right-hand side, we have public health warning, and people are not allowed to work outdoors. So most of the failings that we experienced during extreme weather events in Sydney, for instance, of trees were due to the fact that city crews, landscaping people and so on, they couldn't go in the field to be able to do emergency irrigation of these trees. They weren't allowed. So we couldn't irrigate the trees as an emergency, measure. We didn't have the technology to do, automatic irrigation, because I guess no one invested in that technology ever. And that's why our nature failed. So failures in the social system and the technological system led to a failure in our natural system. So we need to look at the three spheres, the ecological, the social, and the technological sphere and challenges and strengths as a way to create redundancy and ideally compound safety when we are talking about climate-ready, nature-based solutions. If we are species one that is failing, well, we need species three and maybe ecological process free to be able to create this redundancy. Overall, we need to have these infrastructural, technological, governance, and ecological spheres working together to overall compound and increase the safety of nature-based solutions in the first place, but also in public health and so on. How do we do that? Well, one way I found, after a lot of data churning, is actually to use diversity. This is a study we published a couple of years ago. We reviewed tree planting records in 500 cities globally, and we found that as humans, we imported almost 5,000 species of trees in our cities globally. You can see different colors here, different climate zones, but diversity and biodiversity, and to a larger extent, the diversity of strategies that we're using for nature-based solutions is the key here. It's our insurance hypothesis, our insurance policy. We need to have diversity. We can't only rely on a single approach. Then we need science to drive what we are doing. This is another example from Australia. You can see the climate niche. This is mean annual temperature at the bottom of Alocagerina verticillata, which is a very common tree. In red, you have a native niche, and in gray, you have the urban niche. On the left-hand side, you can see that the urban niche, the maximum where we planted that particular tree in the walled city, it's very well aligned with, the native niche. So we kind of figure out that that tree was living around 50 degrees Celsius mean annual temperature, and we planted in cities around the same spot. A very close congeneric species, Alocagerina tolurosa, though, is actually planted in much cooler urban areas compared to where that species could be planted in nature. So we can simply adapt and use that nature into a much hotter city to be able to essentially use these unrealized opportunities to drive climate change adaptation through nature-based solutions. So overall, what we can do here is to treasure failure. First of all, acknowledge that we fail, but we also need to export success. Unfortunately, we never record failures. So I can't learn from failing because people, urban planners and so on, they don't want to record their failures. It's tough acknowledging that you fail, but we need to do that. And we need a global network to do that because climate is global. It's not just California. We have a lot of cities globally. These are just an example of 70,000 cities I plotted in a climate space. These are cities with more than 1 million people, highlighted here with the centroids. Most of these cities are increasing their maximum air temperature by the end of the century by up to 8 degrees Celsius. Many cities are actually getting more precipitation, particularly in Asia, so they might be able to go by. But we need this global network, and we need a series of living labs where we can test nature-based solutions somewhere and use these climate analogs to try to predict what species might be doing in the future. And then we need to work with communities and businesses. It's not enough to do this as scientists. This is a $10 million project that we finished recently in Australia. It was funded by Alt Innovation Australia, which is the umbrella organization that joins all the plant growers across the country. And in this particular project called Which Plant Where, we did a lot of science. I'm not going to go into the details, we don't have time, but we launched this plant selection tool. You can put your location, your zip code here, and automatically this tool is going to suggest hundreds of different species that are climatically suitable at your location by 2030, 2050, and 2070. We use a lot of climate data here, a lot of species occurrence data here. But we really hope that by having this co-produced science with growers and people and gardeners and so on, we can actually change completely the narrative of how we are doing urban greening and nature-based solutions that are really climate ready. I look forward to work on this, on something similar here in California, in the United States. Unfortunately, we are lagging behind. Final consideration is what is already in place, like our policies and rules and all of that. We need to fix maladaptive policies. This is, again, another example of Mr. Musk and Tesla, who came to South Australia maybe 5 years ago and created the large battery ion assembly in the world. A very well-intended policy. Everybody was getting rebates and incentives to essentially, put a solar panel on their roof and charge their electric cars and so on. In California, by 2035, we need to have a completely electrified fleet. Guess what? Everybody's buying a new solar power for personal use, and everybody's chopping down their trees because they need the sun on their roof. These are perverse policies. They are both well-intended, the energy-saving policies and power generation policies are completely undoing what urban greening policies are doing. If we want to use nature-based solutions, we need to fix this, because that's not going to happen, that we can win the battle to climate change if there is this type of problems. So finally, we need to transform the curves of this climate curve. And this can be a climate lifeline for nature-based solutions. We have the tools, we have the knowledge, we have the science. Time is ticking, but the 50-degree world is already here. And thank you for listening. I would be happy to take any of your questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Ossola. Fantastic. Any immediate thoughts, questions from the group? Please feel free to unmute yourself or type something in the chat. I do have a question that I may if I can just kickstart this, Dr. Ossola. You sort of at the beginning mentioned how this idea of nature-based solutions has really gained ground politically and from the policy space. In the US, that's very much the case. We're spending a lot of time talking about nature-based solutions. The federal government is in the process of putting together a national nature assessment, even just to get a handle on what's happening. My question is, from your perspective, why? Why now? Why is nature-based solutions gaining so much political steam? What do you think are the particular levers, and what do you think are the potential pitfalls in that, based on your work just now, that you spoke about?
Thank you, Eric. Bunch of considerations, I guess. The delay depends on political cycles and funding cycles and all of that is happening mostly at the federal level. I think that at grassroots level, we're actually doing that already. It's just that we don't term them as nature-based solutions. Nature-based solution is something that is mostly an academic exercise, if I need to be honest, even though it was embedded it came from the European Union regulations. In America, we have been doing green infrastructure planning for decades, and we actually invented that. The issue with green infrastructures is that was only related to urban stormwater management, at least initially. So we were using, plants and other living organisms to essentially trying to cover the shortfalls of traditional engineering approaches in doing urban stormwater management. nature-based solutions, if you will, is the extension of that concept, where we are not just looking at water issues, we are looking holistically at the broader landscape. Of course, then there is also a recognition that after we studied, the human microbiome and the benefits that nature around us can provide to community in terms of public health and human well-being, there is also the recognition that being closer to nature is actually important for us. We had a study during COVID-19 of 5,000 gardens across the planet, and we demonstrated that gardening during COVID was a lifeline for stress relief and connections to nature, not for production at all. People weren't interested in doing that because of producing food. They were interested as a coping mechanism, and nature was evolved to be able, not to go mental. So we know that, and finally we can acknowledge that even in policies in Canada, in the UK, in Australia. Medical doctors now, they can prescribe nature instead of drugs as part of a therapeutic plan. So we know that we can do that. The challenge is to use the benefits and that nature can provide at all different levels, comprising climate change adaptation. Is not just one goal that we need to address here. That's why I'm stressing the fact that people in different city departments or different federal agencies and things like that, they should really sit down together and try to iron out all these perverse outcomes in different policies. Because if we don't solve that planning landscape in the first place, then we can innovate as much as you want, but you're just wasting opportunities to be able to do that.
Yeah, thanks. I do have a question that Darshani Pearson sent over. Darshani sent it to me direct, so I'll read out the question for you. Darshani says, "Thank you for the really interesting talk. Where I live in California, residents in the 1950s planted redwood trees in areas of the East Bay, mainly because of nostalgia for vacation in the mountains, and that they can no longer sustain them. However, many of these have died or are in the process of dying. In addition to increasing fire risk, some dead or dying trees have fallen, endangering numerous homes and children playing in the backyards. They cannot be cut down because of protected tree status. Even if possible to do so, the permitting process is long and expensive." Two questions. How can we spread the message about how important it is to manage these giant trees that are not native to the areas while navigating these archaic regulations? And should there be a statewide regulations, so California statewide regulations in some instances, as opposed to local and county levels?
So I was actually talking to Katie, one of my master's students in environmental policy and management, recently about the need to eventually sunset policies. We need to give policies an expiry date, in my opinion. It's either we are transitioning to something new and better, improved. Otherwise, some policies, they don't make sense anymore. I mean, I understand protecting the redwood is important in the right place. Where the redwood comes from, this particular forest I have here in the back of my screen, yes. Urban nature is not nature. It's a nature that we design, and we should allocate also enough money to be able to properly care for that nature, to do maintenance, to do all of that. I get phone calls from people from all over the country about the new Inflation Reduction Act, the new infrastructure bill, and all of that. The Forestry Service is going to get $1.2 billion for new tree planting across America, which is a very well-intended policy, but is only for tree planting. It's not for making sure that the tree is going to go to size safely and without dropping their limbs and so on. Even that policy, in a way, is also perverse because, yes, we're going to plant 1 billion trees in the next 5 years. Guess what? There are not 1 billion trees in the market currently in America. We don't have things to plant, to the point that now the city New York wants to rejig the 1 million tree program that they did a decade ago. And now, because of the inflation, because of market shortages and things like that, the cost of a single tree in New York City tripled. So we don't have even the budget to plant a third of the trees that we intended. So all these things, they have to be solved by looking at the problem holistically. You can't do that by pushing regulations down. It's not going to happen. You've got to talk to growers growing the trees in the first place, so they know that they can plant a tree now and sell the tree 5 years from now, having the certainty that the price they're going to get is the price that they can actually make a living. And at the same time, you have to work with communities to convince them that planting a tree is actually good for them, not just removing the tree from their backyard because it is, shading your solar panels. So these are the win-win-win situations where we should really invest a significant amount of effort for climate change adaptation.
Yeah, thanks. We do have a question from Leonardo. How to evaluate nature-based solution policies to avoid maladaptation, taking into account these solutions that these solutions take a long time to be implemented?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I am a data guy. I love data overall. I love being able to essentially use different data streams from different, even different fields completely, maybe engineering, maybe ecology, maybe climate change, adaptation, anything really. And then ask a question to the data sets that are really complex. Of course, they are very interactive. There are so many variables, but now we have even the tool computationally to do that. Think about big data. Think about artificial intelligence. Now we can write essays. Our students are, super happy with that. We can actually increase our predictive capability a lot. And then we have to be creative in how we validate that, though. I bring up a different example in Sydney again. I'm working with Sydney Water. Tree roots are intruding the pipes of Sydney Water, creating $20 million damage every year. In Sydney, we have 651 tree species planted. What we did here, we have a paper under review. We use artificial intelligence data to mine Sydney Water infrastructure data, the pipes, how deep they are, all the different characteristics, all our tree inventory data, plus all the covariates, environmental, climate, and so on. And now we shortlisted 100 species of trees that we think the data tells us that might be problematic. And now I have a postdoc in Sydney. She's working with Sydney Water's crews. She's going into every single pipe, extracting a piece of root, and we're using 4 DNA markers to be able to validate that the species that we got from artificial intelligence algorithm are actually the right species, because we use genomics to validate our data. If I get it right, I'm going to save Sydney Water $20 million a year in avoided cost for their entire life. So their original investment of $1 million that they gave us is actually a very good investment in 5 years' time. So these are the win-win situations where we need to sit down and, acknowledge that, yes, Houston, we have a problem. We can use science, big data, artificial intelligence increasingly, and then trying to forecast how synthetic policies that might actually not exist just yet, that we can envision, can have outcomes and effects, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. I know it's really hard. We can't predict how humanity is going to emit carbon very well, but at least, playing with scenarios, I guess, is my way to go.
Okay, great. Thanks. Next question from Reese. Is there a database that shows which trees are ideal for each climate zone?
Yes, we have for Australia. I'm working soon on a new project that is going to be funded by the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research. I can't disclose fully just yet what's happening there, but I'm hiring a postdoc right now. And for America, we are modeling similarly like we did for Which Plan Where in Australia, only urban tree crops in this particular stage. So tree species that are producing some sort of food for humans. It may be, your leaves, it might be nuts, it might be fruits or whatever it is. So I hope that we'll be able to model, let's say 200 species, but my idea is actually to go much, much bigger and to model the entire horticultural flora really available across the entire United States in all the different markets. So I really hope that after Congress is going to pass, hopefully, touch wood, the 2023 Farm Bill, and they're going to refund efforts like the Office for Urban Agriculture, Innovative Productions, and other efforts that are doing through the Forestry Service. I really hope to have the capacity to scale up.
Yeah, that's a big undertaking. Yeah. Reese has a follow-up question. Is there a threshold or a certain amount of trees per acre that would correspond to an amount of urban cooling desired? Or is it simply planting as many trees as possible that are appropriate for that landscape?
Okay, thank you, Reese. A couple of points there. Urban cooling with vegetation is depending on two different factors. One is the shade that your tree can, generate and shade your buildings and so on. The second mechanism is called evaporative cooling. So the amount of water that the tree is transpiring over time that is helping us humans to feel less hot. So what we need to do is to try to have a selection of plants that are, increasing shade, but also keep these evaporative cooling benefits at a level that is sufficient for us. That's challenging though, because some trees are very, very efficient in doing that, but they're also using a lot of water. So then if we don't have, water enough in the landscape to do irrigation, like we don't have during, water restrictions, that's a limit. So for example, by doing xeriscaping, that is very popular in some areas, like in Arizona now and all of that, yes, we have a very water efficient landscape, but it's also very, very hot. So we need to strike a balance and ideally, as I suggested before, use the diversity that we can play around with. Remember, in California, we have 6,000 species that are native to California of plants. So we have a huge diversity. It's not in the market yet, so we can't use it in other landscapes, but we have the potential to use this nature to be able to do this. The issue is trying to figure out, as you said, which thresholds are the sweet spots. And this is where we are, I guess, doing most of our research for the next 10 years, I guess.
Yes, great. Great. Thank you so much. I know we're coming up on time, and so I don't want to keep everyone beyond what they've budgeted. So first, to thank you so much, Dr. Alessandro Ossola, for the wonderful presentation and for the really lively, stimulating discussion that is coming through in the chat. I really want to just send my appreciations to everyone and your time. And I hope, Alessandro, that it's okay for folks to reach out to you separately.
Absolutely.
In case they have additional questions. And I know there's a lot of exciting research projects planned from your end, and so I'm really excited to see what comes of that. And a quick announcement, really sort of building off of what Alessandro was talking about today. Next week, same time next week, we have Dr. Jennifer Norris, who we have a privilege of hosting next week from the California Natural Resources Agency. She's going to talk about cutting the green tape initiative, using biodiversity to further climate action at the state level. And so we'll look forward to that, and you'll get many more announcements from us. So Sophia's going to help us with that. And that's it for today. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Ossola. Thank you, everyone, for being here. This is how to get in touch with all of us. And I look forward to seeing all of you in future events. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.